The police chief vanished without a trace, but it was the dog's sudden howl that revealed a truth no radio could. What if the only soul who understood your silence was a dog? In the snow-covered stillness of Idaho, a missing officer, a quiet little girl, and an old German shepherd crossed paths in a way that would change each of them forever. No sirens, no speeches, just three broken hearts finding their way back through something wordless and true. This is not just a story, it's a quiet miracle. Stay until the end and let it slow your heartbeat. Because sometimes, healing begins in silence. Tell me, where are you watching from? And have you ever been saved without a single word? Winter, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Snow had fallen during the night, blanketing the streets of Coeur d'Alene in a clean, aching hush. It was the kind of silence that made you hold your breath without meaning to, as if even the wind was trying not to disturb what had settled. At the edge of Lakeside Avenue, a small girl moved slowly along the sidewalk, her boots making soft crunches in the fresh powder. She walked like someone who didn't have anywhere urgent to be, but didn't want to stay still either. Her name was Junie Lambert, and she had only been in this town for 3 weeks. She wore a thrifted parka 2 sizes too big and a knitted beanie with one long thread unraveling at the back. Tied to the zipper of her small, faded backpack was a silver star keychain, glinting weakly under the dull sky, the kind a child might call her lucky thing without ever explaining why. In her pocket, tucked like a secret, was a small notebook with a felt cover. She wrote in it every day, not pages and pages, just lines. Some days, a sentence. Some days, just one word. She didn't like talking much. Words often felt like bruises when they landed wrong. That morning, she stopped at the end of 5th Street, where the sidewalk curved past the Coeur d'Alene Police Department. A patch of salt had melted the snow there, exposing wet concrete and boot prints frozen in mid-step. And sitting just inside the black iron gate, silent, watchful, and still as carved stone, was a large German shepherd. His fur was the color of old cedar and blackened ember. One ear stood straight while the other dipped forward, the way a broken branch might lean into its weight. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just watched. Junie slowed. The dog's eyes didn't follow her exactly. They stayed steady on the middle distance, like he was waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. Still, he noticed her. That much she could tell. She sat on the curb, her breath fogging in the crisp air. She didn't reach out to him. He didn't come closer. It wasn't that kind of moment. He had a leather collar, darkened by time, with a small silver tag that caught the light just enough for her to make out the name. Ash. No last name, no badge, just Ash. The kind of name you gave something that had been burned once and somehow kept glowing anyway. A crow cawed in the pine above them. Neither of them looked up. The stillness between girl and dog felt natural, not awkward. Some things in life don't require introductions. Some souls recognize each other by what they don't say. Junie pulled out her little notebook and rested it on her knee. She scribbled slowly in pencil, then paused, looked up again at the dog, looked down. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the sleeve of her coat. A snowflake landed on the back of her wrist and melted there. Then she wrote, "I don't know how to talk to people, but I think the dog understands that." Ash didn't blink, but something in his posture, the way his tail unfurled slightly, the way his chest rose in a deeper breath, made her feel like maybe he had, in fact, heard her. She stayed there for another 10 minutes, maybe more. Time felt different around quiet things. Eventually, a voice shouted from across the street. A woman in a navy jacket, her grandmother, was waving, calling her in for lunch. Junie didn't answer, just closed her notebook, stood, and gave the dog a small, almost imperceptible nod. Ash didn't move, but his eyes followed her this time. Just a little. That night, Junie sat at the small table in her grandmother's kitchen, stirring soup without eating it. The old clock above the window ticked loud in the silence. Snow pressed against the glass, blurring the world into smudges of white and gray. She pulled her notebook back out, opened to a fresh page. This time she didn't write about school or her mom and dad, or the quiet between rooms at bedtime. She wrote just 2 words in the middle of the page. Ash waits. She didn't explain what that meant, but somehow she knew he'd still be there tomorrow. The morning started like most others in Coeur d'Alene that February. The lake held a skin of ice just thick enough to reflect the weak sun. Snow still lined the sidewalks, pushed up into small mountains at every corner where the plows had passed. In the distance, pine trees bowed under the weight of last night's flurry, their dark green softened by white. At the police department, the front steps were quiet. A light wind rolled through, rattling the flag on its pole, but no one seemed to notice. Inside, coffee brewed, radios hummed, and on the bench outside the main door, Ash sat alone, watching the road. He always waited there once morning patrols began. Mason's truck, an older white SUV with a fading department decal on the side, had pulled out just after 8. Ash had watched it leave with a single lift of his head, then settled down again, resting his chin on his paws. The other officers didn't bother him. He wasn't theirs, he was Mason's. And today, like every day, he waited. But today wasn't like every day. Ash had always known the rhythm of Mason's returns, the hum of tires, the heavy door shut, the gate of boots up the stairs. None of it came. Noon passed. The snow melted slightly along the edge of the station's roof, dripping soft rhythms onto the sidewalk. Ash remained still, but something in him tightened. Then came the static. A voice cracked through the dispatcher's radio just after 12:40. Garbled, faint, unfinished. Something about mile 14. Then silence. The voice had been Mason's, but it hadn't sounded like Mason, not steady, not clear. It was quickly followed by a brief flurry of calls, questions, overlapping voices from other units. Nobody had answers. The GPS ping from Mason's unit wasn't working. The weather had interfered before, so no one panicked. Not yet. Inside the station, a younger officer chuckled nervously, half joking about how Mason probably just stopped somewhere for a nap. He said it too loud. Ash stood. The room fell quieter. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He simply walked to the back hall where the kennels were, sat at the closed gate, and let out a low sound, not a whine, not quite a growl, something closer to a question spoken in dog. Officer Dean, the only one who really paid attention to Ash besides Mason, looked over. "What's up with him?" he murmured, stepping forward. Ash didn't break eye contact. The sound came again. Dean hesitated, then unlocked the latch. Ash didn't wait for a command. He bolted through the station doors, turned sharply down the street, and took off like a shot toward the lake road. Half a mile away, Junie was walking slowly along the trail near the tree line behind her grandmother's house. The sky was the color of pewter. She hadn't seen the dog this morning. Somehow that had unsettled her more than it should have. She'd spent most of the morning sitting on the back steps, her notebook closed in her lap, eyes scanning the empty road in front of the police station. Now, on the trail, she walked slower than usual. Her fingers were stiff inside her mittens. The lake was still visible through the trees, gray and quiet. The way she imagined her mother must look when she slept with her back turned. Junie didn't like the way the trees sounded today. Too still, no crows, no wind. Then she heard it. A low, rhythmic thudding across snow, growing louder, sharper. She turned, and there he was. Ash. He came out of the trees like a shadow cut from light. No leash, no handler. His fur was dusted with frost, and his breath came in hard clouds. His eyes locked onto hers for only a second. But in that second, Junie knew. He wasn't out for a run. He wasn't wandering. He was moving with purpose. Ash passed her without pause, barely brushing her coat with his side. But Junie pivoted and followed. She didn't call after him, didn't ask why. She just started walking behind him, boots crunching in his tracks, eyes watching the tense set of his shoulders. They moved deeper into the woods, past the familiar trails, past the tree where she once saw a fox. Junie had never gone this far alone, but she wasn't alone now. The trees grew thicker, the light thinner. Ash slowed only once. When he reached the first sharp slope, he turned his head slightly, checking. Junie was there, breathless, pale, determined. He went on. Back at the station, no one had noticed yet that Ash was gone. Officer Dean would realize in another 10 minutes and radio it in. But by then, it wouldn't matter, because Ash had already found the trail Mason's truck had taken, and Junie was right behind him. The silence in the woods felt louder the deeper they went. Snow had begun to fall again, light but steady, filling in their footprints almost as soon as they made them. The wind tugged at the tops of trees. Somewhere far above, a hawk called once and was gone. Junie pressed on, legs aching, fingers stinging despite her gloves. But she didn't stop. She couldn't explain it, but something in the way Ash moved told her this wasn't pretend. This wasn't a game. Someone was waiting. Or maybe someone wasn't. And that was worse. The woods dipped without warning. What had seemed like a gentle slope from above dropped into a sharp ridge, and for a moment Junie had to stop, catching her balance as her boots slid in the loose snow. Ahead of her, Ash paused at the edge, standing motionless. His tail was still, his body rigid but not alarmed, focused. Below them, nestled awkwardly in the gully between two banks of frozen earth, was something metal and broken and wrong. Junie blinked. The police SUV, white, familiar, marked with the same fading decals as the one parked behind the station every morning, lay on its side. The windshield was a shattered web. One tire spun weakly in the air, making a soft ticking noise as it caught the wind. The hood had buckled in, steam rising from its seams like breath from a wounded animal. Ash didn't move. Junie moved toward him slowly, heart hammering in her chest. Her mittens felt too heavy, her legs too light. She took one step closer and then another. Snow had begun to fall again, gently, quietly, dusting everything in its path, including the wreckage. Soon, it would be covered. Forgotten. Except it wasn't. Junie swallowed hard. Is he? Her voice came out small. She hadn't meant to speak, but the question hung there anyway, twisting into the cold. She looked at Ash, but he didn't glance back. He was already descending. The way down was steep. Junie followed on instinct more than skill, slipping and catching herself with mittened hands, snow dampening the cuffs of her coat. When her boots finally landed on flat ground, she stood in front of the broken vehicle, unsure of what to do. A sharp smell stung her nose. Gasoline or oil, maybe both. The side mirror hung by a single wire, and the driver's side door was dented in like it had tried to collapse. Ash stepped forward first, his snout brushing against the cracked window. He didn't bark. He let out a low, throaty sound, a sound of recognition, not warning. Something lived inside that silence. Junie edged closer. She could see movement now. Inside, slumped across the steering wheel, was a man. His uniform was torn, shoulder twisted awkwardly, head pressed forward against the glass. Blood streaked down from his hairline, seeping into the collar of his coat, already half frozen. One hand hung limp beside the gearshift, the other pressed weakly against his side. His face, Junie had never seen it up close, but she knew it. The man who walked Ash every morning, who never smiled, but always nodded when he passed. She remembered the way he looked once when someone had left a box of donuts on the front counter at the station, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to enjoy something. Now he looked like someone barely holding on. Junie stood still. Then slowly, she dropped to her knees beside the wreck. "Hey," she whispered, not expecting an answer. "Hey, mister?" The man stirred. Barely. His lips moved. Nothing came out. Ash stepped closer, pressing his body against the metal of the vehicle, almost as if he were trying to transfer his warmth into the steel. Junie set her backpack down and unzipped it with shaky fingers. Inside, she fumbled for a moment before pulling out the only soft thing she carried, a folded handkerchief, blue cotton with worn corners. Her mother had given it to her once, for when your heart needs something quiet to hold. She didn't understand it then. She might now. She reached up, awkwardly wiping blood away from the man's brow, careful not to press too hard. "You're bleeding," she said softly. "But you're breathing." The snow kept falling, soft, relentless. Junie looked around. No signal. No sounds but the whisper of branches and the occasional hiss of steam. The world had folded in here. There was no help coming. She turned to Ash. He stood poised, ears forward, eyes locked on her. His breath rose in clouds, thick and steady. She looked back at the man. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven pulls, each one like a question that might not get answered. Junie's voice trembled. "I don't know what to do." Ash moved then. One sharp motion. He stepped back from the car, looked toward the slope, and then back at her. The message was clear. Go, but she didn't. Not yet. Junie reached forward and gently took the man's hand, the one that hung nearest. It was cold. His fingers twitched slightly, then stilled again. "You're not alone, okay?" she whispered. "I'm here. I'll stay." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ash made another sound, more urgent now. He nudged her shoulder with his nose. Junie looked at him, eyes wide, wet. Then she nodded. "Okay, you go." Her hands trembled as she pulled her backpack closer and zipped it shut. "Go get help, Ash. Please." As if released from something, Ash bolted, bounding up the snowbank with a grace that defied his size. His paws kicked up white behind him. He disappeared into the trees, leaving only his tracks behind. Junie turned back to the broken window. She reached through the crack and rested her mittened hand on the man's arm. "I'll stay," she whispered again. "I won't let you freeze." She sat there in the snow, drawing her knees to her chest, small and shivering, one hand still resting on the arm of a man who didn't yet know she was there. Snowflakes landed on her eyelashes. The wind moved through the trees in long, tired sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was running like it knew exactly what the world was about to lose. Ash ran with the kind of certainty that didn't come from instinct alone. It came from memory, from miles of walking the same paths, from knowing where the houses were, Which ones had porch lights that stayed on? Which roads stayed plowed in storms? And which windows meant warmth? The snow swallowed the sounds of his paws, but not their rhythm. He ran low and fast, his thick coat catching white at the edges, breath steaming out in clouds behind him. Trees blurred past. The forest narrowed, then widened, then opened near the southern edge of Coeur d'Alene, closer to the old neighborhoods, where the lake curled into its quietest bend. Ahead, a small craftsman-style home sat tucked between two birch trees, its windows fogged with heat and age. Inside, a lamp glowed amber in the front room. The porch light flickered, then held. There was no motion beyond the glass, just the soft shudder of a curtain stirred by draft, and a figure hunched beside a radiator with yarn looping from her hands. Ash leapt onto the porch without hesitation. He scratched once at the door, sharp and low, the way he always did when Mason arrived home late, and Ash wanted to let someone else know he was still waiting. No answer. He scratched again. Nothing. Then he padded toward the side window, reared up slightly, and tapped his paw against the cold pane. Inside, the woman looked up. Eloise Lambert, Junie's grandmother, paused mid-stitch. Her fingers were stiff from arthritis, her back curved in permanent caution. She was the kind of woman who had learned to live alone in a house with too many shadows and too many teacups. She didn't like being startled, but something about the dog outside, his posture, the look in his eyes, cut through her wariness. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt, and walked to the door, opening it halfway. "Ash?" she said, confused. "Where's your officer?" Ash barked once. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Eloise stepped onto the porch, frowning. Ash turned, took 2 steps, then stopped, looked back, waited. The wind pushed a strand of gray hair across Eloise's cheek. She hesitated, then grabbed her coat from the hook and slipped it on over her cardigan. "What is it?" she murmured, more to herself than to the dog. "Where's Junie?" Ash didn't answer with sound. He ran, down the steps, across the patch of snow where her rose bushes used to grow, onto the trail that wound behind the neighborhood and into the trees. Eloise followed, not running, but walking faster than she had in years. The cold burned her lungs, her boots sank into snow, her scarf whipped behind her. But she didn't stop. It took longer than Ash wanted. He circled back once, urging her forward with another bark, then returned to the path ahead. Branches scraped her coat, her breath grew uneven. The silence of the woods felt deeper now, more loaded, as if it were holding something it couldn't contain much longer. Then, as the trees thinned, she saw it. Junie, crouched in the snow beside a crushed SUV. Her coat half frozen, her cheeks pale, one mittened hand pressed against a cracked window. Ash had already reached her and was standing between the girl and the wreckage, tail low, body still. Eloise's heart surged. "Junie!" she called, louder than she'd spoken in days. Junie didn't move at first. Then she looked up. Her lips were blue, her eyes wide, distant, as if she hadn't realized how cold it had gotten until someone said her name out loud. Eloise scrambled down the slope, her knees buckling once in the drift. But she made it. She dropped beside her granddaughter, pulling her close, wrapping arms around her with more force than she meant to. "Oh, baby, you're frozen. What in heaven's name?" Junie only whispered, "He's still breathing." Ash stepped forward, pressed himself against the wreckage again. His thick body curved around the driver's side like a shield, as if holding the cold at bay through sheer will. Eloise reached out, touching the man's shoulder through the broken window. His body was slack, but warmth still lingered beneath the soaked fabric. His name came to her slowly. Mason. The quiet officer with the sad eyes. She had seen him once at the grocery store, helping an older woman pick up cans after her cart tipped. No fanfare, just steadiness. "We have to get help," Eloise murmured, but the signal was still dead. Then, like an answer to prayer, distant voices began echoing through the trees, the sound of boots on snow, radios crackling, flashlights cutting through the dusk. A search party had been dispatched after Officer Dean found Ash's empty kennel and connected the dots. They followed Ash's path. They trusted the dog. When they reached the scene, EMTs took over. Voices became commands. Hands moved quickly. A thermal blanket was wrapped around Junie. Someone offered Eloise a hand to help her back up the slope. But she stayed kneeling beside the girl, one hand still resting on Ash's back. And Ash, never looking away from the man he had come to trust with his life, leaned in closer, pressed his head gently against the edge of the doorframe, and waited. Junie whispered something as the EMTs loaded Mason onto the stretcher, but no one heard it. Only Ash, perhaps. The storm was still falling, but quieter now, more like a lullaby than a threat. And in that snow-choked silence, something sacred had just been held together long enough to survive. The ride out of the woods was slow and silent, except for the crunch of tires over snow and the low static from the EMT's radios. The narrow trail had barely enough room for the rescue truck, its headlights sweeping through the dark trees like a searchlight over a memory. In the back seat of the second vehicle, Junie sat wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and antiseptic. Her cheeks were red now, but not from the cold, more from something thawing inside her, something unfamiliar. She held Ash's collar tightly in both hands, as if letting go might unravel what they'd just barely held together. Ash sat beside her, pressed close. He didn't sleep. His ears twitched with every shift of the road. The heat inside the truck fogged the windows, turning the outside world into a watercolor of headlights and snowfall. No one spoke. Even Eloise, sitting in the front passenger seat, kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes forward, lips a thin line of breathless gratitude. The ambulance ahead carried Mason, his body strapped and braced, IV lines humming with medicine. He hadn't opened his eyes, but his pulse had stabilized. His breathing, while shallow, had grown steadier under oxygen. The paramedics had murmured about internal injuries, a head wound, potential hypothermia, but their movements weren't rushed anymore. They were measured, controlled, the kind of calm you only show when you think someone is going to make it. The kind of calm that had been earned by a girl kneeling in the snow and a dog who had refused to stop searching. As they approached the edge of town, the forest gave way to streetlights and front porches dusted in powder. Most of the town was asleep, but not all of it. At the corner near the fire station, a woman stepped onto her porch in slippers, drawn out by the sirens. She held her robe shut with one hand and peered into the cold with narrowed eyes. When she saw the convoy of vehicles, she clutched her chest. Not in fear. Something else. As if she knew, without knowing, what had been brought back from the woods. The hospital in Coeur d'Alene was small, tucked just off Northwest Boulevard, its brick exterior softened by age and snow. Warm light spilled from the emergency entrance as the doors slid open and the first responders wheeled Mason inside. Doctors and nurses surrounded him like a moving wall, and in a moment, he disappeared into a room behind closed curtains. Junie didn't follow. She stayed on the sidewalk outside the doors, blanket around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the place he'd vanished. Ash stood beside her, his breath steaming against the glass as he watched the corridor beyond. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't shift his weight. He stood like he had in the woods, still, silent, waiting. Inside, Eloise signed papers and answered questions. Someone offered her coffee. She declined. She glanced at Junie once through the window and saw the girl standing exactly as she had when she first arrived. Small, upright, holding on. A nurse eventually came out. She was middle-aged, with tired eyes and kind hands. She knelt beside Junie and smiled softly. "He's stable now," she said. "He's not awake yet, but he's warm and safe." Junie didn't answer, but something in her shoulders lowered. The nurse touched her arm gently, then left. The girl sat down on the cold bench outside the hospital entrance. She didn't ask to go inside. She didn't ask to be taken home. She just sat, blanket drawn tighter, eyes staring into the snow. Ash curled beside her, his body resting against her boots. Together they waited. Inside the hospital room, Mason's body lay pale and unmoving beneath a thin blanket. His uniform had been cut away, revealing bruises along his side and stitches along his hairline. His left hand twitched occasionally. At one point, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he turned slightly in his sleep, as though feeling the pull of something just outside the room. On the bedside table sat a small folded piece of fabric, blue, soft, creased. A child's handkerchief, still stained faintly with dried blood. No one had placed it there. It had arrived tucked in Mason's coat pocket, folded so carefully it seemed sacred. The nurse hadn't dared move it. She didn't know what it meant. But Mason, somewhere beneath the haze of sedation and pain, did. And in that place between waking and forgetting, he dreamed of snow and small hands, and a warmth beside him that had asked for nothing in return. Later that night, long after most of the lights in the hospital had dimmed, Junie finally rose. Ash followed. They didn't go inside. They didn't knock. They simply walked the corridor once, slowly, until Junie stood in front of the closed hospital room door. She didn't reach for the handle. She took the notebook from her pocket, opened to a fresh page and wrote something quietly, deliberately. Then she tore it out, folded it twice and slipped it under the door. She turned without a word and walked away. Ash followed, and somewhere behind that door, the steady beeping of a monitor kept time with the breath of a man who would wake to find more than a scar and a stitched uniform. He would wake to find that someone had waited for him and never left. The room smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and lemon disinfectant, overlaid by the quiet hum of machines breathing in rhythm with the man in the bed. Mason Hall opened his eyes slowly, not from a jolt, but like someone surfacing from deep water, unsure whether the air above was cold or kind. Fluorescent light softened behind the curtain. His throat burned, his ribs ached, and somewhere beneath all of it, he felt the weight of something unfinished. He didn't speak. Not yet. A nurse moved in the corner, adjusting IV lines with practiced care. She was older, calm, the kind of woman who had long since stopped filling silence with chatter. When she noticed he was awake, she simply nodded and said, "You're back." Mason blinked once, slowly. "How long?" His voice was hoarse, barely there. 3 days, she said. "You've been sleeping most of it. Concussion, rib fractures. You lost a lot of blood, but you're here." He nodded slightly, eyes drifting to the ceiling, trying to pull the last thread of memory through the fog. The road, the guardrail, the flash of white. Then snow. So much snow, and pain, sharp and sudden. Then, nothing. No. There had been something else. A shadow, a warmth, small fingers. "Someone found me," he said, more to the air than to her. The nurse smiled faintly and stepped aside, revealing a folded piece of paper resting on the side table. It was creased down the center, twice folded, the way children do when they don't know what else to do with what they've written. "She left this," the nurse said. "Wouldn't say much. Just slipped it under the door and disappeared with your dog." Mason reached for the note with a slow, uncertain hand. His fingers felt stiff, and the tape on the IV pulled slightly as he unfolded the page. It was lined notebook paper, written in pencil, a child's handwriting, a little uneven but deliberate. "I didn't know if you were going to wake up, but I didn't want you to be alone if you didn't. My mom always said it matters who stays, even when there's nothing you can do. I stayed. I hope that helped. Junie." He read it once, then again. He stared at the final line for a long time, his fingers closing around the paper, not to crumple it, just to feel it was real. Something inside him, something buried under years of silence and regret, shifted. Not a flood, not a breakthrough, just the slow turning of a lock. The nurse spoke again gently. "Your dog's been in every day. Comes in with the little girl, sits by the bench outside your window, stays until the lights dim." Mason tried to sit up. Pain bloomed across his chest, but he didn't stop. "I want to see them." The nurse hesitated. "Later today. For now, just rest. They'll come back." But Mason didn't close his eyes again. Not right away. He turned toward the window. Snow was falling in slow, lazy spirals, peaceful, not dangerous. He reached into the drawer of the bedside table, pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he removed a gold band, worn but clean. He held it between two fingers, then placed it on his chest, just over the place that still ached, but no longer felt entirely empty. That afternoon, Junie walked quietly beside Ash down the hallway toward Mason's room. The blanket from the rescue had been replaced with her regular coat, zipped to her chin. Her backpack bounced softly against her shoulders. She didn't look nervous, but her grip on Ash's collar was firmer than usual. When they reached the door, she paused. "Do you think he remembers me?" she whispered. Ash didn't answer, but he pressed forward, nudging the door open with his nose. Inside, Mason was sitting up in bed, pale but alert, the band of light from the window catching the edges of his tired eyes. He looked up the moment they entered. And when he saw Junie, something in his face, something that had been held tight for too long, eased. He didn't speak right away, just motioned to the chair beside the bed. Junie sat slowly. Ash lay down beside her, resting his head on her boot. They stayed like that for a while. No one filled the silence. The machines kept their soft rhythm, the snow fell against the window, and a kind of peace settled in between them. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice low. "You stayed." Junie nodded. "I didn't want you to be cold." He looked down at the note still resting on the table. "It helped," he said. Junie didn't say anything. Ash stood and stepped forward, placing one paw gently on the edge of the bed. Mason reached out, scratched behind the dog's ear, the one that never stood quite straight. "You knew," he murmured. "You knew where I was." Ash didn't wag his tail, but he stayed, leaning into the touch. Mason turned to Junie. "Your mom. She sounds like she was a good person." Junie looked out the window. "She tried. Sometimes people don't stay even when they want to." Mason's gaze softened. "Then it matters even more when someone does." The room grew quiet again. But it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that allowed two people and one dog to understand each other without saying what hurt. The kind of quiet that felt like the beginning of something, Not big, not loud, but steady. Healing doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it enters the room on tired feet, holding nothing but silence and a folded note. And sometimes that's enough. The notebook was small, no wider than her hand, its cover wrapped in navy blue felt, the edges slightly worn from being carried every day. It didn't look like much, sitting there on the hospital tray between a plastic water cup and a crumpled tissue. But to Mason, it might as well have been sacred. It had been handed to him earlier that morning by a nurse with a curious look, passed along with a simple explanation. She wanted you to have this, said she's finished with it. He didn't open it right away. He wasn't sure he should. There was something private about a child's journal, even one willingly given, but Ash, lying quietly at the foot of the bed, lifted his head when the notebook was placed down, his gaze steady, almost urging, as if he too understood that some things are meant to be read, not for information, but for understanding. Mason waited until the nurse left. Then, with careful fingers, he opened to the first page. Day 1. It snowed today. I didn't say anything at breakfast. No one noticed. He turned to the next page. Day 3. I saw the dog again. The one with the crooked ear. He doesn't bark. I like that. The handwriting was uneven, deliberate. Some entries were just a sentence. Some were longer. Some were scratched out. Mason read slowly. The way you might watch snow fall when the rest of the world is rushing. Intent, but not hurried. Page by page, the girl's thoughts unfolded like whispered confessions she had no one else to give. Day 6. Dad hasn't called. Maybe he forgot which day is mine. Maybe it's not mine anymore. Day 10. Sometimes when it's really quiet, I pretend I'm a dog. Dogs don't have to explain how they feel. Day 14. The officer with Ash has sad eyes. I think maybe he misses someone too. He stopped there. His thumb hovered over the edge of the page. He could feel it, somewhere in his chest, that sharp ache of being seen. She hadn't known him, not really, but in 3 lines, she'd reached a place most people never touched. He turned the page. Day 20. I was scared in the woods, but I didn't want to leave him alone. He looked like Mom did when she was in the hospital, like he wasn't ready to go but wasn't sure if anyone would ask him to stay. Mason closed his eyes for a moment. The memory of cold, of stillness, of drifting into the edge of somewhere too quiet came rushing back. He remembered warmth, too, something small and trembling beside him. A voice, thin but sure, saying, "You're not alone." The next page was dated after the rescue. Day 23. People keep saying I was brave, but I wasn't. I just didn't want him to freeze. That doesn't feel brave. That just feels fair. Day 24. I keep thinking about how he looked before the lights found us. He wasn't moving. I was afraid I'd be the last person to see him alive. I didn't want that to be a secret I had to keep forever. Mason sat with that for a long time. Ash stirred beside him and rested his head on Mason's foot. The warmth of it grounded him, the steady weight of loyalty that didn't ask for recognition. He kept reading. Toward the back of the notebook, Junie's entries began to change. They were less about what she saw and more about what she hoped. Short thoughts, sometimes just a few words, sometimes only fragments. Maybe it matters to show up. Maybe dogs are better at loving because they never expect anything back. Maybe being quiet doesn't mean being invisible. He reached the final page. I don't know if he'll keep the journal, but I want him to know. He didn't die, and I didn't run. That has to count for something. Mason sat back in the hospital bed, holding the little book like it was a map through something he hadn't realized he'd been lost inside. He looked over at Ash, whose eyes were half closed now, but still alert. "She didn't run," Mason said quietly. "She stayed." Ash didn't move, but Mason felt the dog's stillness like an agreement. There was a soft knock at the door. Then it opened a few inches. Junie stood there, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hands in the pockets of her coat. She didn't step in, didn't speak first. Her eyes went to the notebook in his hands. Mason held it up slightly, then patted the chair beside the bed. She came in and sat down. He didn't say thank you. It felt too small. Instead, he set the notebook on the table, turned toward her, and said, "I didn't know how much I needed someone to stay." Junie didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Me too," she said. They sat like that for a while. No more questions, no more pages, just two people and one dog, and a silence that no longer felt empty. The stove inside the Coeur d'Alene Police Department wasn't much more than a black iron box with a dusty glass door. But the heat it gave off was real, steady. It hummed in the corner of the break room, just beyond the row of lockers, and an old coffee machine that hissed more than it brewed. Outside, the late winter sun slipped behind the trees, casting long lines of pale gold across the tile floor. The shadows were soft now. Not the heavy kind that come with worry. The kind that come when something has settled back into place. Mason sat on the worn leather bench just a few feet from the stove. His arm was still in a sling. His ribs still ached when he moved too quickly. But his eyes were clearer, his voice steadier. He had come back to work only that morning, not to pick up his badge, not yet, but to sit in the place that had shaped his life for over 2 decades and remember what it felt like to belong somewhere again. He didn't come alone. Junie sat beside him, legs dangling off the edge of the bench, her backpack tucked beneath her knees. She wore a red knit hat, too big for her head, and a fleece jacket zipped all the way to her chin. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She didn't speak, but her eyes moved slowly around the room, studying the badge case on the wall, the coat hooks, the scratched table with initials carved into the wood. This wasn't her world, but she had stepped into it anyway, and somehow it felt less foreign than before. Ash lay between them, head resting on his paws, ears twitching every now and then, like even in rest he was listening. He had chosen his spot carefully, not too far from the stove, not too close to the door, a place of watching, of staying. They had been sitting like that for nearly 20 minutes when Mason finally moved. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded, neatly, carefully, a small square of soft cloth, white with faded embroidery in the corner. It looked like something long held, long protected. Without speaking, he placed it in Junie's lap. She looked down, confused at first, then slowly unfolded it. It was a handkerchief, pressed and clean. "Is it yours?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Not anymore." Junie traced the edges with her fingers. "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because someday," Mason said, voice low, "someone else will be cold and scared and alone. And you'll be there. And maybe you'll want to give them something that says, 'You matter. I'm not leaving.' This helped me. Now it's yours." She didn't answer, but she folded the cloth again and placed it gently into the front pocket of her jacket, as if tucking it next to her heart. The stove crackled softly. Outside, wind brushed against the windows in long, quiet sighs. The world didn't rush them. No one came into the room. No phones rang. Time moved slower in that small warmth. Mason leaned forward, rubbing the back of his neck with his good hand. There won't be a medal, he said. No parade, no headlines. I don't need one, Junie said. I know, he replied. They sat again in silence. But it wasn't the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had already said what mattered, and were content to let it linger. Ash stood, stretched, and moved toward Junie. She reached out, and he leaned into her side, his body pressing gently into her leg, his head turned toward Mason, as if asking what came next. Mason smiled slightly. You're not done yet, buddy. Then he turned to Junie. How would you feel about walking him in the mornings, while I'm on desk duty? Junie blinked. Alone? No, I'll be here. But out there? He nodded toward the frosted windows. That's his world, and I think he likes sharing it with you. Junie looked at Ash, then at Mason, then back at Ash. She nodded. A few moments later, they stepped outside. The air was crisp but not bitter. The snow had thinned on the sidewalks, patchy now with the first hints of early spring beneath. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't mean empty, it just means peaceful. Ash trotted ahead, leash loose in Junie's hand. Mason stood on the steps, watching them walk to the end of the block and back again. When they returned, Junie handed over the leash without needing to be asked. Mason took it, but not before crouching slightly to speak to her eye to eye. You kept your promise, he said. You stayed. So did you, she whispered. Ash leaned in and pressed his nose between them, breaking the moment with a soft exhale, warm and steady. They laughed, just once, but it was the kind of laughter that made space in the chest where something had been tight for too long. The porch light flicked on behind them. The day had turned to evening without fanfare. No goodbyes were said. Junie simply turned and walked down the path toward the sidewalk, Ash trailing beside her. Mason watched until they turned the corner. Then he stepped back inside. Some promises are loud, shouted in courtrooms or signed in ink. Others are quiet, sealed by a hand in the snow or a dog that doesn't run. And the ones that last, the ones that matter, are the ones made without needing to be spoken. The thaw came slowly in Coeur d'Alene. Not like the sudden bloom of spring down south, but a patient, inching retreat of snow that revealed the bones of the earth in fragments. Patches of dead grass, half-frozen puddles, a forgotten mitten beneath a fir tree. But with each passing day, the air grew less sharp, the mornings less gray, and with it, something else softened, something less visible, but no less real. Junie began walking with Ash every morning, just after sunrise. She never asked permission anymore. The unspoken rhythm had formed. She'd step onto the porch of her grandmother's house, zip her jacket, tug her star-shaped keychain into place, and Ash would already be there, waiting by the gate. He never barked, never rushed her. He walked beside her like they'd been doing it for years, like she belonged in that space beside him. They didn't speak, of course. One couldn't, the other didn't need to. Their path took them along the lake first, where the water still wore a fragile crust of ice that shimmered in the morning light. Geese had started to return, their calls echoing in the cold air. Junie would pause sometimes, just to watch them. Ash would sit quietly beside her, ears alert, tail brushing gently against the frozen gravel. People began to notice, not in a loud way, in the quiet, side-of-the-eye way small towns do. At the gas station, Mrs. Ellery, who'd taught Sunday school for 30 years, tapped her husband's elbow as the pair walked by. "That's Mason's dog, isn't it? The one from the rescue?" Her husband nodded, but said nothing. At the diner, Harold, The cook, with arms like tree trunks and a heart full of rumors, watched them through the steamed window. He told no one, but later that day, he slipped a bag of bacon ends into a small paper sack and left it on the edge of Mason's desk without a word. At the library, Miss Francis, who knew every child's name in town, placed a book about animal rescue in the return bin. Inside it, tucked between the pages, was a note. For Junie, I thought she might understand this one. No one said much directly to her. That's not how Coeur d'Alene worked. But nods became more frequent. Doors were held open. Smiles lingered just a second longer. It was a slow knitting back of something frayed. At home, Junie's grandmother, Ruth, noticed the difference first. The girl's sleep had grown deeper, less tangled with movement and murmurs. Her drawings, once tense sketches of dark forests and eyes without faces, now featured dogs, trees, sometimes a lake. She didn't talk more, but she didn't flinch when touched. And sometimes she hummed while brushing her hair. One morning, as Junie laced her boots, Ruth asked quietly, "Do you think he waits for you because you're special?" Junie didn't look up, just smiled softly and said, "I think he waits because he knows what it's like to be left." Ruth didn't ask again. Meanwhile, Mason returned to his routine but with a changed rhythm. He still drank black coffee from the chipped mug his wife had once given him, still walked the halls of the station with a limp he pretended not to have. But something in him had tilted, not outwardly, not in ways that made anyone whisper, but in the way he paused longer at the bulletin board, or the way he stood with his hand resting on Ash's head, longer than necessary, when the dog returned from walks. He began writing again, small notes he never used to bother with, just quick observations tucked into a drawer. One of them read, "Trust returns like spring thaw, slow, quiet, unnoticed, until one day there is grass again." He didn't talk about the accident, or the rescue, or the girl. But every Saturday, he left a sandwich wrapped in wax paper at the front desk. Junie never saw him do it, but it was always there when she passed through on her way to meet Ash. Sometimes she left a note in return, hidden beneath the napkin. "Ash found a rabbit today but let it go. The lake is making noises again, like it's waking up. He waits by your office when we come back. I think he still needs to see you." The world didn't stop for them. People still moved away. New families arrived. Sirens still rang. Papers still filed. Snow still fell in bursts even as flowers tried to bloom. But the town had made space, in that quiet, necessary way small towns do, for a girl, a man, and a dog who had all nearly disappeared, and didn't. One late afternoon, as Junie and Ash walked past the firehouse, the chief stepped outside and tipped his cap. "You've got a good partner there, young lady," he said. Junie looked down at Ash. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The porch light flickered gently at the Lambert house, casting a golden hue over the wooden steps and the small rocking chair that creaked when the wind pushed through. Spring had come slow and shy to Coeur d'Alene, like a guest uncertain whether it was truly welcome. There were still mornings when frost clung stubbornly to the fence posts, and afternoons when sunlight warmed only one side of the street. But the earth was shifting, softening. The lake no longer sighed with ice. The pine trees no longer shivered. And on this particular evening, change came quietly with the turning of a doorknob. Mason stood at the threshold, Ash at his side. His duffel bag was slung over one shoulder, boots worn, jacket unbuttoned from a long shift and longer thoughts. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to ask, though not with words. Junie opened the door before he knocked, as if she'd been listening for his weight on the boards. Her socks were mismatched, one red with a white stripe, the other plain gray. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping like always. She stepped back, and he nodded once. No explanation, no question. Ash brushed past them both, tail low, ears relaxed. He had already decided where he'd sleep tonight. Mason looked down at Junie. 3 nights, he said. She didn't nod, but she didn't flinch either. We'll be here. That was all. Inside, the house smelled of rosemary and wood polish. A kettle hissed faintly in the kitchen. Ruth was somewhere deeper in the house, humming an old song that never quite found its rhythm. Mason set his bag down quietly near the door and looked around. Everything had its place, but none of it tried too hard to look perfect. A vase of dried lavender, a pile of folded dish towels, a drawing taped to the fridge, stick figures beneath a large brown dog. Junie led Ash to the small nook near the fireplace. His bed was already there, a thick folded blanket, and one of her old sweatshirts tucked into the corner. He circled once, then lay down with a slow breath, the kind that comes when a body remembers it is safe. Later that night, Junie sat on the floor beside Ash, knees drawn to her chest, a pencil moving quietly over the pages of her journal. She didn't write with urgency. She didn't seem to be recording anything in particular. Just tracing shapes, thoughts, pieces of the day that might only matter to her. Every now and then, she glanced at Ash, who blinked slowly back. "Do you think he dreams of snow?" she whispered. Mason had entered the room without her noticing. He leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "He dreams," he said softly. "I don't always know what of." She looked up. "When you were gone, he didn't make a sound. He just waited. I think he was afraid if he barked, he'd miss something." Mason stepped forward and lowered himself into the armchair nearby. His movements were slower now. Not from injury, not entirely, but from the kind of heaviness that comes after carrying too much silence for too long. "I was afraid of the same thing," he said. Junie didn't reply, but she uncrossed her legs and reached over to lay her hand on Ash's shoulder. The dog didn't move. He simply let her stay there, anchored. Outside, the wind picked up just slightly, rustling the branches of the cedar trees that lined the yard. In the quiet that followed, something passed between the three of them. Not conversation, not comfort exactly, but a mutual understanding that whatever had come before, it had brought them to this moment. Not whole, but held. Before bed, Mason placed a small folded note on the table near the door. Junie would find it in the morning. It said, "You saved me. Not just that day, every day after." She would never show it to anyone. That night, Junie dreamed of the lake in summer, of Ash running through tall grass, his ears lifted by the wind, his paws kicking up soft earth. She dreamed of Mason standing beneath a tree, hand outstretched, not calling her, but waiting, knowing she'd come. In the morning, the sky was pale blue, the kind that promised more than it could say. Junie zipped her coat, slipped the handkerchief into her pocket, and stepped onto the porch. Ash was already waiting. Before she reached the gate, she turned back toward Mason, who stood with a mug in hand, watching through the window. "I'll keep him safe," she said. Not loud, not certain, but enough. And Mason, with a hand pressed briefly to the glass, replied without speaking. Ash nudged her leg. They walked toward the lake, slow and steady, and in the final lines of her journal that night, written with no hurry, she simply wrote, "People don't always know how to save each other, but sometimes a dog reminds them how to begin. Sometimes we wait years for someone to say the right thing, But this story reminds us that love, loyalty, and healing often arrive without a single word. In the quiet town of Coeur d'Alene, a little girl, a grieving officer, and a scarred old dog didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to stay, through snow, through silence, through sorrow. And that was enough. Maybe you've known a silence like that. Maybe you've met someone, human or not, who sat with you when no one else would. If this story touched something in you, would you share it in the comments? Tell us, who was your Ash? Who stood by you when the world went quiet? We read every word you leave, and somewhere out there, someone might just need to hear your story to begin healing their own.